So I'm Bryce Rampton, soybean product development agronomist for Western Canada. It's always so funny. We spend so much time all year getting the crop in, making sure we're establishing a good stand, controlling weeds, controlling other pests throughout the season, managing different weather events. And then we get to harvest and we're in such a hurry to get everything done that we're not really paying attention to what we're leaving behind. So harvest loss is a big issue. I think a lot of the times we don't always know what our harvest loss is, and a big part of managing that loss is first understanding just how much we are losing. So harvest management, we always think it's lost out of the combine, but really managing a good crop and a good harvest starts at the very beginning. It almost starts at planting. On a soybean plant, the first node off the ground, so the cotyledon node and sometimes the unifoliate node, is really the lowest point that a pod can form on the plant. So any strategy that we can incorporate that can lift that off the ground, so planting into warmer soil and better conditions, maintaining high populations so plants help themselves push out of the ground and extend that hypocotyl length above ground really helps getting the header underneath that first node. Another strategy is managing any rocks or clumps of mud or dirt that we have in the field, any trash, with a roller. So making sure that field is a level surface, pushing any other material down so that we can run that header right along the ground. Reducing our loss really starts even before we get the combine in the field. So when a soybean plant reaches R8, so that 95% brown pod maturity, we got about a week to 10 days before we realistically need to get out there in the field and before it's ready to go. So I think the risk is sometimes, in Western Canada, we got a lot of different crops. We got wheat, we got canola, we got other pulses. And oftentimes we can be really busy getting all those crops off and we're leaving the beans out there in the field and we're saying, well, they're not too bad for shatter. They'll be okay. And that's true. Soybeans are a little bit less susceptible to shatter, but there is varietal differences between that. So we want to be picking a variety that is good for shatter. But what happens is when they're out there and they dry down and then we get a rainfall. So we get a rain, the seeds do swell up inside those pods and then they dry down again. If you get a couple of those rain cycles, those swelled seeds can pop open the pods and we see that shattering loss. So it is really important to get out there in a timely fashion to get the crop off. The second aspect is when we actually do get the combine out into the field. So we got a couple of different points that we can lose yield from field loss when we're combining. So one is at the header, we call that gathering loss. So that can happen from either shattering on the plant, so seeds popping out of the pods onto the ground. It can happen from stubble loss, so we're cutting too high off the ground, we're leaving pods on the plant lowered down. It can happen from what we call loose stalk. So this is when the knife will actually cut the plant, but the plant doesn't feed into the header and it falls forward off the table onto the ground. And then the last one is what we call lodge stalk. So that's actually when the knife doesn't cut the plant fully and it just gets pushed over underneath the head and not onto the table. So actually that accounts for about 80% of what we usually see of total harvest loss in a lot of different cases. So it's really important to understand and manage that. The last aspect is really once it does make it through the combine, we have our threshing, separating loss associated with that. So that's our final point, and that's the last little bit that we get. So every combine has a manual and different aspects of managing that and how to set that accordingly. So another thing to watch for and understand, of course. So the one question we always get is, do we need an aerial? Is it a required thing? What's my loss associated with there? And I would say it really varies. So I think those conditions where we see the most loss, where we can benefit from aerial, is when it gets really dry. So under those dry conditions, we see a bit of a shorter stature from our soybean plants. The same thing kind of happens when you get into those tough, difficult conditions in some areas, those tough soil types, so that we don't see as much plant growth. So what really happens in those cases is the plant's so short that it gets cut by the header, by the knife, but it can't be fed in. So it's either too short that the reel doesn't fully get it and it just doesn't tip into the header and falls forward. So when we have an air reel, it blows those plants onto the head. The other one would be if we're in really dry conditions. So during middle of the day, we get hot conditions and it doesn't take much for those soybean seeds to pop out of the pods. So as soon as the reel hits it, we get that shatter on that reel and it falls onto the ground. And if we have that air reel, obviously it blows all that material in as well. So if you don't have an air reel and said, we're still getting shatter, and getting an air reel for that season isn't an option, it's best to target your harvest to the higher humidity points of time of the day, so when the reel does hit the plant, it doesn't cause that immediate shatter. So mornings and evenings, it's not always good to shut down middle of the day, but sometimes you got to manage that. So how much loss am I really incurring from not having an aerial? So under those bad conditions, like I was saying, if you got a really short crop, or maybe if you are in those dry conditions, we've seen upwards of a 55% reduction in loss actually from studies that were done in Manitoba from having an aerial in those cases. So like I said, it's not going to happen all the time, and it really depends on the scenario. But when you do have those issues and when you do have those conditions, an aerial can be an extreme benefit. All right, so one consideration we need to make when we're assessing loss is just how fast we're traveling. Speed can have a big effect on how much loss we see. So when you're analyzing your losses and you notice that there are some stubble loss there are some pods still attached to the plants underneath after we've gone through. But it varies a lot through the field. That's one thing that can happen with speed. Even when we're really confident that we are cutting as low as possible, when we go a little bit faster, you start to see header bounce, start to see side-to-side fluctuation in height. That can lead to higher levels of that stubble loss. And then when you're cutting into the middle of the plant too, in those cases, you are getting some shatter. So that's one thing to consider. The other thing is to watch if your knife is actually keeping up with the cutting. Sometimes when we go faster, we can start to see a lot more lodged plants underneath getting pushed down by the header. And in those cases where we do lose entire plants to that underneath, that's when we can start to see extremely high levels of loss. So to put it all together, we want to make sure that we're thinking about harvest even at planting. We're getting out there in a timely fashion when our crop is ready to go, and we're going through the proper methods to assess our overall loss while we're combining in the field.